Okay. Occasionally I get an email asking me something related to the lecture. And as you recall, I've asked at the beginning that if you do have a question that's related to the material, anything that's not of a personal nature, to please post it on Quarkus. It's very important because anytime you have a question, chances are somebody else has a question. Okay? And if you feel like, oh, you know what, I missed a lecture and probably you already told us what we should do, ask a classmate. Okay? You at least know the people in your group, ask them. But again, if it is something that's not of a personal nature, please just post that on the discussion board. At the end of the class last week, a few of you came up to me, and I was actually glad that you did. Because you asked me, and again, maybe you felt a little bit shy to ask during class because you thought, oh, maybe I missed it, maybe it's not clear, and maybe I'm just not getting it. And you asked, a couple of you actually, independently, how can incorporating genetics, how exactly does it minimize residual confounding? And how exactly does it prevent recall bias? So again, I'm glad you asked me because my answer to you back then was, I haven't explained it yet. And so that's going to come. We have to stop our lecture a little bit short. I didn't get as far as I wanted to with the example of caffeine, genetics, and heart disease. And so my answer was, once we've gone through those examples, you will be able to look back at this list and say, oh yeah, because we have genetics, we can improve our measure of the exposure. And because we incorporated genetics, residual confounding is probably not an explanation for the phenomenon that we were observing. Whereas in any other observational study, you cannot exclude or rule out residual confounding. But again, with genetics, hopefully after I've explained it, you'll agree that, oh yeah, residual confounding is probably not explaining this phenomenon. Again, genetics can pinpoint the bioactive, help us elucidate mechanism, and in the case of case control studies, where any case control study, recall bias essentially cannot be ruled out, or it's very difficult to rule it out. But again, as you'll see, with genetics, you'll be able to say, oh yeah, there's no way recall bias is at play here. So these are some of the general shortcomings or limitations of nutritional epidemiology that this addresses. I then talked about the link specifically between coffee and cardiovascular disease and some of the controversies or issues that are challenging our interpretation of the link between coffee and cardiovascular disease. And these are, again, coffee or associated lifestyle. This is, they're not completely independent of the other general factors, but these are again a little more specific to coffee. So is it coffee or associated lifestyle? What does that kind of remind you of? What is that similar to in terms of the other issues on the previous slide? Is that recall bias?
Confounding.
Which kind of confounding? Yeah. Yeah. General confounding as well as residual confounding. You're right. Okay, so coffee drinkers tend to be different than non-drinkers in many ways. And so even though we can adjust for many of those known confounders, there's always a possibility of residual. But again, lifestyle is an important factor. The issue of coffee abstainers being at higher risk. Remember I mentioned that a number of studies show a U-shaped or a J-shaped association, right? This was initially identified with alcohol and heart disease and the so-called, French paradox, where some researchers just, didn't want to believe that moderate consumption is protective. And they pointed out, rightfully so, that maybe it's not that moderate alcohol or moderate coffee or moderate anything is protective. It's that those who are abstainers, right, this end of the scale, have a higher risk because they purposely avoided consuming, whether it's alcohol or coffee, because they thought that it's probably not good for their health. But they have this strong family history, this strong genetic risk of the disease that even if they cut that out, it's not enough to save them, and it's still going to catch up to them. So the whole issue of whether or not coffee abstainers just have a higher risk versus moderate consumption actually being protective, it's very important to be able to differentiate between those two, right? It means the difference between possibly recommending moderate consumption for some people versus saying, no, those who are avoiding it, they need to know that they, it's not necessarily helping them, but maybe they need to do other things. The issue around age, again, is a possible modifier, confounder or effect modifier. Right? Some studies tend to see associations among younger individuals, but then studies done in the elderly find no association between coffee and heart disease. So if you do a study on a population of octogenarians or nonagenarians or centenarians, people that are in their 80s, 90s, 100s, and you don't see a link between coffee and heart disease or coffee or death, does that mean coffee doesn't do anything? Why would age be important? Got a group of pretty old people. Of course, when I'm 80, I'm not going to think that's old, but for now, I think we can all agree that's relatively old. And you're doing a case control study. Right? You don't find a link between
You're not capturing any people that died earlier than those ages, which is sort of finding heart disease.
Yeah, I mean, these are the survivors. These are the ones that stuck it out, and for whatever reason, they've lived that long. So coffee is not going to be a major risk factor. So usually it's thought that in earlier ages, that's when risk factors or the effects of risk factors predominate. And last point, again, when it comes to any, get back to the previous slide, any nutritional epi study, what is the bioactive? What is the mechanism? How can we pinpoint a specific component that's responsible? And coffee is no different, right? It's a complex beverage, all kinds of bioactives. Is it the caffeine? If it is, we can do something very specific. Right? I gave you guys the example of alcohol and it was esophageal cancer. Certain carcinogens that were produced when barley or hops were exposed to a naked flame. So very specific, based on the method of preparation. Right? And coffee is also prepared very differently. Right? French press versus paper drip, filter, paper filter versus metal filter, you get completely different chemical compositions there. Again, even just a paper filter versus a metal filter. Those two types of coffees, for those with a discerning palate, actually taste different, but the chemicals are different because the paper filter traps some of the lipid type of compound. So again, these are issues that are part of kind of the general issues in nutritional epi, but specific to coffee. So one thing I wanted to point out is that, again, I'm sure most of you who have experienced caffeine one way or the other, to some extent, know to self-regulate, right? And I think I asked you this in the very first lecture, when we were talking about things that you avoid, things that you dislike, and some didn't like coffee for different reasons. Still trying to remember why one of you didn't like cauliflower. I think it was the color, was it? Something I hadn't heard before, but anyways. So for coffee, caffeine, people tend to self-regulate. And it's based on, to some extent, a balance of the kind of positive effects, right? I think we can all agree that increased alertness, mood, and those are kind of generally positive attributes, versus the adverse effects, the raciness, the jitteriness, the anxiety, the nervousness. I put wakefulness in the middle because that could be a good thing or a bad thing, right? Obviously, a lot of people will say, oh yeah, that's definitely in the upper category because that's why I drink coffee, make sure I don't fall asleep in class. But for some, if you consume coffee, after 2 in the afternoon, and if it keeps you up all night, that's not a good thing, right? So that's insomnia, so it can go down here. But generally, those acute physiological effects that you feel with caffeine, it's that kind of balance of it. And to some extent, there's tolerance to caffeine, right? If you become a regular coffee drinker, you can tolerate a bit more. But most people tend to kind of plateau, right? It's not like by the time you hit 30 or 40, you're drinking, 20 cups a day. If you're drinking 6 now, you generally tend to kind of, taper off. But some people do drink 6, 7, 8 or more cups a day. And obviously they've developed some level of tolerance to the various effects. And of course, genetics does contribute to all of these effects. Some people feel much more anxious with just a tiny bit of caffeine. And for them, their threshold is much lower. And of course, a cup of coffee is not a cup of coffee anymore. This was just a number of years ago. Tim Hortons got rid of their small and renamed it extra small. Just kind of shifted things over. So as this pattern continues, eventually this is going to be the extra small. And it's probably going to be off the chart there, who knows. 24 ounces. That's like this volume of the stomach, I think. Right? Obviously, most people aren't chugging 24 ounces at a time, I don't think. But in terms of research, usually it's a standard 8-ounce cup of coffee. And in questionnaires that are administered to participants, but again, you'd be hard-pressed to find an 8-ounce cup of coffee anymore. Right, so just keep that in. I don't know. Does anyone know how to silence this watch? It's always giving me answers to questions I didn't even ask. Yeah, so most, I don't think Tim Hortons sells 8 ounces anymore. Starbucks doesn't. Yeah, that looks like close to 24 back there, if not 20. But again, from a research perspective, when they talk about cups, if you look at the methods, they're somewhat standardized. And so when individuals are asked to participate in the study, usually the researcher will show them what a cup of coffee looks like. Now, the nice thing about caffeine and the genetics behind caffeine is we know it's like a drug. It's a pure chemical. It has a very specific composition. It's called 1,3,7-trimethylxanthine. There's a xanthine base and 3 methyl groups at those positions. And it's metabolized almost exclusively by CYP1A2. That's an enzyme that's expressed in the liver. It's responsible for more than 95% of the breakdown of caffeine. And it converts it into a more water-soluble compound called paraxanthine, which is just 1,7-dimethylxanthine, another name for paraxanthine. And that's the rate-limiting step in the detoxification or elimination or metabolism of caffeine. And then paraxanthine is broken down into other more water-soluble compounds, and then they're excreted in the urine. So the nice thing about the gene that codes for CYP1A2 is that it has a common polymorphism at that position. So remember, we use RS numbers as unique identifiers for a SNP. Right? So the 762551 is known, it's a known SNP for CYP1A2, and it causes an A to C substitution that has a profound effect on enzyme activity or inducibility, as you can see here on the y-axis. So if both of your parents gave you the A allele, that makes you essentially a fast metabolizer. You have about a 4-fold higher rate of metabolizing caffeine than a slow metabolizer. So there's a bit of uncertainty in terms of the difference between heterozygotes and homozygotes for the minor allele, the C allele. But for the most part, you can group them together as slow metabolizers. In some cases, we can call the CCs ultra slow, but at least from this particular study that measured the activity of this enzyme, you can generally group them together because compared to the homozygotes, they metabolize it at a fraction of the rate. So roughly half of you here are fast metabolizers, and the other half are slow metabolizers. And unless you've tested yourself genetically, you can't really tell. Because even if caffeine makes you feel anxious, or if it keeps you up at night, or anything like that, those physiological effects of caffeine has nothing to do with how quickly it's metabolized. We used to think it was. Initially, when we did this research, more than 15 years ago, we thought that slow metabolizers just drink less, right? Because if the caffeine sticks around in their system longer, they don't need that second or third cup to maintain the buzz. But it turns out there's no difference in how much caffeine the fast and slow metabolizers consume. Because what you feel when you consume a caffeinated beverage are the stimulating effects of caffeine when it binds to the adenosine receptor that's expressed in the central nervous system. That's what causes that wakefulness, that alertness, and even that jitteriness and anxiety feeling. So depending on how tightly and how long caffeine binds to the adenosine receptor, that's what causes those acute physiological effects that you can feel. You can't just feel what your liver is doing or how much is floating around in your blood. So when we were trying to figure out the link between coffee and cardiovascular disease, we reasoned that if slow metabolizers have an impaired ability to get rid of caffeine, and if caffeine is a component in coffee that might trigger a heart attack, then we would expect the slow metabolizers to be at a higher risk, right? Because they can't get rid of it as quickly as fast metabolizers. Fast metabolizers, pretty much as soon as they're drinking it, it's getting urinated out. So we conducted this case control study. This is work that was done by my very first PhD student, Marilyn Cornelis. She's now a professor at Northwestern University in Chicago. And as part of her PhD, she worked on this project where we had, over 2,000 cases and 2,000 controls. So for a case control study, pretty big sample size. And then we assessed coffee consumption using the food frequency questionnaire and then genotype. Now, you know from Dr. Hanley's lecture that food frequency questionnaires are notoriously imprecise for estimating some aspects of your diet, but not all aspects of your diet. Do you know when they do validation studies on a food frequency questionnaire, do you know how that's done? Does anyone know how to validate a food frequency questionnaire?
Against usually some sort of diet record or
Yep. If you have blood biomarkers, you can correlate that, but usually against weighed food records. Right? So, person usually 7-day food record. So they're writing down everything that they're eating, and they completed a food frequency questionnaire, and you look to see how well those two things correlate. The assumption is that a 7-day food record is the gold standard, but we know that that has its own problems, right? Because people just change what they're eating if they know they're going to have to write down everything, right? And so if you're used to going to a buffet every Friday, you're probably going to be like, okay, I'm not going to go this week because I got to fill out this questionnaire. That's how am I going to keep track of, all these noodles and wontons that I'm eating at the buffet. So when it comes to the validation, though, it's tough to, food frequency questionnaires are not the best at estimating total caloric intake, energy intake. They're not the best at estimating carbohydrate intake, right? So if you're having dinner and let's say you're having, pasta and meat sauce, can you really estimate how much pasta you're eating? I couldn't. I'd probably be off by 40, 50, 100 grams, who knows? So when it comes to some of those macronutrients, it's difficult. And so FFQs have their limitations there. Same thing when capturing fat intake. But generally, they're not too bad at grouping people into relatively low fat versus relatively high carb. But when it comes to validation, there's one item on the food frequency questionnaire that has the highest correlation every time, every single validation step. Do you know what that food item is?
coffee.
Bingo. Yeah. Coffee is the number one. That's the strongest correlation. Does anyone know why? Any guess?
You can usually measure or guess how many cups of coffee out of it.
Yeah, but why is that? We know that you can guess it because they're doing it and it's comparable. But what is it about? Yeah. It's almost like cigarettes. A smoker can tell you how many cigarettes they smoke a day because they know, I got 2 in the morning, 1 in the afternoon, this, that, and I smoke 10 cigarettes a day or whatever. So cups of coffee, to some extent, because it's a habit, people know I always have 1 or 2 cups of coffee in the morning, and that's it. Or I have 2 in the morning and 1 at night or whatever. So people know pretty consistently how many cups of coffee. So when you look at correlation coefficients with fat and carbs and other micronutrients, it's somewhere around 0.3 if you're lucky, and that's considered a strong correlation. Coffee is 0.8 and above. So remember that part of your presentation as a group, you're critiquing, evaluating the strengths and limitations of the study. And so be careful of making sweeping generalizations like, it's an FFQ. Well, if you're doing that in the studies involving coffee consumption, that's not really a limitation because an FFQ is a very strong tool to measure coffee consumption. So the first thing we did is just to look to see how common these genotypes were between the cases and controls. And what does this table tell you? What's a take-home message from this table? First of all, why do we want to know the genotype frequency between cases and controls? What does that tell us? Let's say fast metabolizers are much more common in controls or in cases. What does that tell us? But what does this data show? Numbers between cases and controls.
Does that affect if they're gonna drink coffee now? The type of metabolizer you are?
So there's no coffee consumption data here. This is just cases who have a heart attack, who had a heart attack. Yeah, these are cases and controls, and how frequent, how often, or how common fast and slow metabolizers are among those with a disease and those without a disease. So what do these numbers reveal?
It gives an overview of the population, that generally there's very few CC alleles and more, about accurate, the same numbers of heterozygous and homozygous rapid. Kind of
Okay.
overview.
Okay, so as a start, yeah, it tells you just based on this population, roughly half are fast and roughly half are slow. And among the slow, it's mainly due to the heterozygotes. What else does it tell you? That's just on the overall, but you don't need the cases to tell you that, right? You just need the controls. But you do have information on the cases, and there are numbers there. And what does that tell you?
The distribution of the different genotypes between the controls and the cases are relatively the same.
Yeah. They're pretty much identical for all intents and purposes, right? This doesn't quite add up to 100 because of the rounding of the numbers. So this is probably, 46.4, 43.4, and 10.4. So they all get rounded down, but that actually adds up to 4, and let's say 2, or whatever it is. But the numbers are pretty much the same between cases and controls. So the frequency of being a slow metabolizer is similar. What does that tell you about the link between the gene and the disease? Pretty much the same number of slow metabolizers in the cases as in the controls. What does that tell you about the link between the gene and the disease? All right, let me change something. Let's say this was 66, and this was 63. Numbers in the bottom are the same. So more controls were fast metabolizers, and these numbers are still the same. This was 66, and this was 63. That doesn't make sense. 23, right? Taken from there. Just testing you guys, and no one called me on it. So 66% are fast metabolized. Now let's exaggerate. Let's go higher. Okay, 86. 86. This will be 3, right? And this is 10. 86 versus 45. What does that tell you about the gene and the disease? Back.
Gaining rapid metabolizer is protected against CE, potentially.
Okay. Did you have a different answer?
Just like there's different correlation, like a weaker one compared to like this percentage.
But what is the link between the gene and the disease? Before we said there's none because the numbers are pretty much identical. So as your classmate said, if this is much higher, if the rapid metabolizers are much more abundant among controls, that's pretty much kind of the normal situation. And cases don't have that version of the gene. So that would suggest that the gene itself protects, right? Being a fast metabolizer is protective. That's if that was the scenario, right? And that's what you would do in a genetic association study. So it's important to demonstrate that there's really no difference. And that tells you that the gene itself does not predict heart disease. Right? So if you're a slow metabolizer, you don't have to worry, because that in itself doesn't predict heart disease. But remember, there's a difference between disease-causing genes and modifier genes. So that tells us that CYP1A2 is not a disease-causing gene, at least in the context of heart disease. All right, so pretty much equal distribution. Now, so that's the gene without coffee. Now we're looking at coffee without the gene. And we just wanted to see what is the link between coffee consumption and heart disease. And here, this graph shows that 4 or more cups of coffee is significantly associated with an increased risk of heart disease. We have an asterisk there, significant p-value. The 95, so the odds ratio is about 1.36, which means a 36% increased risk. Okay? An odds ratio of 1.4 means a 40% increased risk. An odds ratio of 2 means a 2-fold increased risk, and then it goes up from there. What's an odds ratio of 0.7? What does that mean about the risk? The odds ratio is 0.7. Now, think about it carefully before you...
30% decreased risk?
Anyone have a different answer? Right. It's a 30% decreased risk, because the relative risk is 0.7. From 1, that's a 30% lower risk. Now, this is what's called the multivariate adjusted odds ratio. That means we took into account a bunch of confounders. Things like smoking, physical activity, all kinds of factors that are associated with coffee consumption. Now, if we stopped our research there, our study would have gone on to a pile of a bunch of other papers that conclude, yes, drinking 4 more cups a day is bad for you. But the real question we wanted to ask was, is that increased risk due to caffeine? And if we do that, obviously we want to stratify our population by fast and slow metabolizers. So when we did that, this is what we found. Pleasantly surprised. The fast metabolizers, there's absolutely no increased risk. In fact, you start to see signs of a U-shaped association. Right? It's almost a perfect U. Whereas the slow metabolizers, now even 2 to 3 cups a day is linked with a significantly higher risk. If we go back one slide, and you look at the total population, you would say 2 to 3 cups a day doesn't do anything. There's absolutely no change in risk. But that is a mixture of fast metabolizers that seem to be protected and slow metabolizers that are going in the opposite direction. And when you mix them together, they kind of cancel each other out. Now, I mentioned that at the time there was evidence to suggest that coffee might, or caffeine specifically, might trigger a heart attack, more so among younger cases. And so because we had a large sample size, we were able to look at those below the median age of 50. And when we did that, look what happens to the y-axis. Before it was up to 2, now it's all the way up to 4. So in those who are below the age of 50, moderate consumption is now statistically significant and protective. And the slow metabolizers that drink 4 more cups a day have almost a 4-fold higher risk. That's about the equivalent risk of a heart attack of a pack-a-day smoker. That's how big that effect is. Now, given this observation and this phenomenon, we talked about some of those factors, but first of all, before we get to them, so we published this in JAMA, this is Journal of the American Medical Association. It was the kind of thing that got some media attention, headlines like "Gene that could make your next coffee your last," a little bit sensationalist. And then the New York Times had a piece on this later on, talking about how we can't just make recommendations based on the general population when we know that genetics can be such a strong factor. I want you to remember that graph, okay? And think of these points where we said, well, is it coffee or an associated lifestyle? In other words, is it some other confounder or even residual confounding? Let's go back here. Is it possible that residual confounding can explain what we found? That it's not actually coffee or caffeine or anything in coffee. Yep.
Possibly for the AA group. We were talking about before essentially how the control group or the leftmost group, less than 1 cup a day, may have increased risk as they choose to not do coffee for health reasons.
Okay. So you're saying that there's nothing protective in coffee here. This is due to reverse causation, right? Because the abstainers have a higher risk, right?
That's a possibility.
Okay. Does anyone agree with that? Who disagrees with this? Why do I disagree and say that abstainers do not have a family history of heart disease, and they're not avoiding it because of that, and this is not due to reverse causation? In our population, the abstainers do not have a higher risk of heart disease. Reverse causation is not a factor. Am I right, or is he? Oh, that's impressive. They're not sure if I'm right or you're right. Want to change your explanation?
I mean, it depends on study design, but. at
Well, this
same
is the
time-
study design. This is the study design.
At the same time though, the odds ratio for the AC, the slow metabolizers group, I find it difficult to see that any type of confounding would explain away the 4x relative risk.
Okay, I think I'm glad you're addressing that, the other side, but now we're talking about another factor. Now we're talking about the increased risk of coffee, right, as opposed to the abstainer. So just going back 2 slides, remember in the total population, we see this association. Do we know that this is a real effect, or is it possible that this is due to residual confounding? Okay, by show of hands, how many people say that this effect here could be due to residual confounding? Okay, so I see roughly half of you have your hands down, so, and you have to put your hand up for one or the other, all right? So I'll ask one last time. How many people think here this is due to residual confounding? This could be due to residual confounding. Way up high. Okay. How many people say this cannot be due to residual confounding? Unless some of you have disappeared, okay. Those who had your hands down for all of them, how many think this is not due to residual confounding? Can't be. Okay, good. No one has their hands up here. This can be due to residual confounding, right? Because it's just a link between increasing cups of coffee and heart disease. Even though we adjusted for a bunch of things, there could be something that we didn't adjust for, right? Maybe heavy coffee drinkers don't like doing yoga, okay? And yoga is protective. It's it's meditative, it's relaxing, it lowers your risk of heart disease. But they're too jacked on caffeine, they don't go to yoga. So maybe heavy coffee drinker is just a surrogate measure of not going to yoga. And that's what it is. And if we adjusted for that, this effect could disappear. So with the total population, it is possible that that's due to residual confounding. Now we're here. And before we get to the increased risk that we're seeing here, which I appreciate you moved to, I just want to go back and focus on this other factor of reverse causation, right? And he suggested that this is nothing protective in coffee, that this could be due to reverse causation. And so what I'm asking is, why am I saying that is not correct? This cannot be, this protective effect that we're seeing here is not due to reverse causation. It's not because abstainers in our population have a family history of heart disease and they know or believe that they should be cutting back on coffee. Why am I saying that?
Because people don't know their genotype in the first place.
People don't know their genotype.
Yeah.
Okay, that's true. People don't know their genotype. But how does that explain the fact that this is not due to reverse causation? You're very close.
And they won't change any lifestyle.
They won't change their lifestyle. Okay, true. They're not going to change their lifestyle, but they don't need to, right? Because they're not changing their lifestyle based on their genetics. They're changing it based on the belief that coffee is bad. So I'm going to avoid it, and I'm not going to get heart disease. But even though, all my uncles and aunts and brothers and everybody else got, died of a heart attack early. And that's still going to leave me at a higher risk. Why is this protective effect not due to reverse causation? Remember, you have to look at the whole graph. That's the hint, right?
It's also that you ask her why they don't drink coffee or their family history, and you saw that there was no difference between all four groups.
You can, but we didn't have that data. This is the data that we have. All of the data. We're talking about this U-shaped association that others have reported in their total population. And critics said, no, it's not that there's anything protective, it's due to reverse causation.
Is it because this pattern of reverse causation is not seen in the other genotypes as well?
Right. If abstainers had a higher risk, and that's why they're abstaining, then how come these abstainers don't have a higher risk compared to those that just drink 1 cup a day? Just 1 cup a day. If anything, the pattern is going the opposite direction. So if these guys really have such a strong family history, then they should have a higher risk, or at least even a comparable risk as someone who drinks just a cup a day. Right? So you have to compare the two. If this is all we had in our total population, you could say, yeah, it could be due to reverse causation, because we don't know why these people are abstaining. And I'm saying, well, we'll never know, because we don't have their data. And it's okay, because if they had such a strong family history, then these would have a higher risk. And it kind of goes back to what, and that's why I said you're close, because these abstainers and these abstainers don't know their genotype. They're not abstaining because they know they're slow metabolizers, or these guys are abstaining because they know they're fast metabolizers. All they're doing is abstaining for whatever reason. And we don't know what that reason is. What we do know is that if you're a fast metabolizer, consuming 1 or 2 to 3 cups a day compared to someone who chooses to abstain for whatever reason is protective. And it's not likely due to reverse causation, because you definitely don't see it on this side. Right? This is the same population. The only difference between these abstainers and these abstainers is a single nucleotide polymorphism. that affects the rate of caffeine metabolism, which they can't even feel, and it's not directly associated with heart disease. So it's not like the gene is a gene that causes heart disease and early family history and high penetrance, right? Because if it did, in that previous graph, that would have changed the way we interpret this. All right, so that was the one bullet point. We went back to kind of coffee. Actually, we ended up jumping to the second one, but thank you, we've covered that. I think we need to go back to coffee or associated lifestyle, residual confounding. And remember that in studies that see an increased association, like we did with the total population. So the question here was, is this due to reverse causation? Are abstainers at a higher risk because of whatever reason? And we said no, because we were able to refer back to that side. Now we look here and we say, okay, the positive association that we're seeing here, is that due to coffee, or is it possible that this is due to some other confounder that we just didn't adjust for? How many people think that residual confounding can still explain this? It's still possible that this is due to residual confounding? Okay. Tell me why. Why is it possible that this could be due to residual confounding? Yep.
People with those genotypes may have interactions with different alleles. There could be linkage events that cause this type of polymorphism, and that may be due to some other gene that's causing both effects.
So I can tell you just based on the structure of the CYP1A2 gene and the location of that SNP that it's highly unlikely that that SNP is in linkage with a SNP way outside of that gene. Just based on crossover, that's not likely the reason. But even if it is, you're saying that the genetics of slow metabolizers is different? But remember, we didn't see a difference between cases and controls. So even if it is linked to another gene that causes heart disease, we didn't see a higher risk because the distributions were the same between cases and controls. So my question is it coffee or is it residual confounding? Is it, remember I said heavy coffee drinkers aren't going to yoga, and the more coffee you drink, the less yoga you do. And that's why you're seeing this teen dose. So is that possible? Is it possible that this is due to residual confounding?
You're not seeing that in every age group that's taking more than 4 classes,
Right.
which provides the expectancy.
Exactly. Always got to refer back to the other half of this graph. Yep.
For the study, did the participants only drink the black coffee, or did they add milk or sugar to their drink?
Yep. In Costa Rica, most drank their coffee with cream and sugar.
So could it be just like a general metabolism thing? It's like if the person drinks black coffee and they add a lot of sugar and milk, and so they just metabolize everything slower, so those things could cause cardiovascular disease.
So it's a good question. So the CYP1A2 enzyme only metabolizes caffeine. It metabolizes a bunch of other things, like 15% of prescription medications. It actually activates some procarcinogens in cooked meat and stuff. But we adjusted for saturated fat intake, energy, sugar, all those factors. But remember, these 4 cup a day drinkers drink their coffee the same way as these 4 cup a day drinkers, right? Because having this gene doesn't make you avoid putting sugar or cream in your coffee. They prepare it the same way. So even though about 90% of people in the study consumed caffeine came from coffee, we know all the details of that and how they prepare it. You have to ask yourself, well, if you see it on one side but not the other, is that still a factor? So can this be due to residual confounding? The answer is no, because this increased risk, if it is due to something that's associated with coffee starting with coffee consumption, like not going to yoga, then these 4 cup a day drinkers here are equally not doing yoga, right? Because having this gene does not just, it doesn't make biological sense. It doesn't affect your yoga going activities or pretty much any residual confounder you can think of, right? So now we've crossed another item off our list. That it is in fact due to coffee and not something else, because you see it in one genotype but not the other. And here we address the abstainer. Does risk depend on age? Yeah, we saw that. As you go to younger age, the risk gets stronger, and in the fast metabolizers, it actually gets even more protective. Which component of coffee? Well, it turns out CYP1A2 again is pretty specific, and caffeine is the most widely, most abundant substance in coffee that's detoxified by CYP1A2. Now, what we think might be happening here is because they're fast metabolizers. So remember, they still have caffeine. So why are we seeing a protective effect here and not a protective effect there? Remember, some of the papers that you guys are going to be presenting are going to have graphs that are kind of similar. So even though these issues relate in particular to coffee and heart disease, hopefully, I want you to understand the concept behind this so that you can extrapolate that to your own group. Why are we seeing a protective effect? Moderate coffee protects. Remember from last week what's in a cup of coffee? It's a bunch of things, right? Some good things and not so good things. We know that caffeine appears to be one of the not so good things because we were able to use genetics to improve our measure of exposure, right? Because 4 cups of coffee for one person is about the equivalent as less than 1 cup for somebody else, based on how they metabolize it. And because coffee has some polyphenols, antioxidants, some beneficial, some goodies in coffee, the fast metabolizers are able to get rid of the bad caffeine pretty efficiently, and that probably unmasks the beneficial effects of the antioxidants and the polyphenols and whatever else is good in coffee. But why is it that with the 4 cup a day, how come we don't see a protective effect anymore? What might be happening there? Why don't we see that protective effect anymore? Yep.
Get to the threshold.
Yeah, you reach a threshold, the enzyme, even though you're a fast metabolizer, you start to saturate the system. And then the adverse effects of caffeine start to counter the beneficial effects of whatever might be good in a cup of coffee. And that's why by 4 cups a day, you're just seeing that. You're just consuming now more caffeine and the enzyme is not able to catch up, and then caffeine is still having its adverse effects. So we've addressed those, and just see if I have that slide still. Remember, just going back to some of the factors from kind of the broader concept, improving measure of exposure. Gene affects how much caffeine your body is exposed to. Minimize residual confounding. Even though we've adjusted for a bunch of factors, we can now rule out residual confounding. We can identify the bioactive because the gene is specific to that substance that's in coffee. And you can elucidate the mechanism, at least by which something that caffeine does in particular. And recall bias. Give you the answer there. Recall bias. remember what we said recall bias is. Recall bias is when you see a pattern like this, right? And you're worried that, first of all, okay, is it a residual confounding? You know why it's not. But remember, these patients were recruited, the cases at least, because they just got a heart attack. And they're being asked to report how many cups of coffee they consume versus controls in the population. And with recall bias, what are we concerned about? Who does what, and that might lead to recall bias in a case control study?
The cases that are brought forward and how much more.
Yeah, we're worried that the cases might, overthink what they've consumed, and they're probably like, oh yeah, I probably drank too much coffee, and yeah, I was probably drinking, 6, maybe 8 cups a day, and they're overestimating the coffee consumption. And that's going to exaggerate an effect, or cause an effect that one doesn't actually exist. So it's not that there's a real association, it's just the cases were recollecting their coffee consumption differently than the cases. So can recall bias explain this? Well, you think yes, still. Recall bias could actually explain this increased risk. How?
Because like people who have this myocardial infarction might have different, a better, I don't know, like they can remember better or overthink how much they consume.
Yep, they just got a heart attack. They're in hyper overdrive with their thinking, and they're reporting their coffee, let's say, more accurately. Okay, so can that explain that phenomenon? Can the recollection of cases explain why we see an increased risk of heart attack due to coffee? Yeah.
No, because there was equal amount of cases and controls, per genotype.
Right. So remember, this is the reference group. The group, and this is a separate reference group here. Among the fast metabolizers, we have a reference group, and there's a reference group here. And in a case control study, the reference group is made up of a given proportion of cases and controls. There's a ratio of them here. We don't know what the numbers are because I don't have them here. You can find it in the actual publication, but here we don't know, right? You actually just know it from the statistical code. Let's say there was an equal number of cases and an equal number of controls. If there's a twofold increased risk in a group, that means that in this group, with this genotype and who report drinking this much coffee, there are twice the number of cases versus controls relative to this group. And that's why we would conclude that there's a twofold increased risk. So each group has a proportion of cases and controls. And depending on that ratio, whereas here, there's now, compared to this group, there are relatively fewer cases than there are controls, which means that this is probably protective. And so to go back to the question of recall bias, you're saying this could still be due to recall bias because the cases are more acutely aware of what they actually reported. But if that's the case, how come you don't see an increased risk here? Right? Because the cases that are in here, and the cases here and here, are recollecting it just as acutely. Yes?
If these people knew the genotype, their genotype, and that typically AA genotypes would have lower risk and AC or CC would have higher risk, would that then be possible for recall bias or confounding? If
So-
they knew the effects and they were aware of the I know I'm this genotype, so I'm probably less risk. Would that then be open to other factors?
So, first of all, they couldn't have known because we hadn't published this paper yet.
Okay.
And it was the first, but that's a good question. So what do you think?
I would say yes.
Recall bias, so people knew about this, because this is the problem now with doing this kind of research today.
Right.
And you have to, when you have your study participants, you have to ask them if they've ever had a genetic test.
Right.
And so, what information were they exposed to? Because that can obviously bias their decisions to seek coffee or avoid it, right?
Right.
Like, if I was recruited now, I'm a slow metabolizer, and when it comes to caffeinated coffee, I'd be in the lowest group. But that wasn't the case 15 years ago. I would have been in, whatever, two cup a day. So that's a good question. I mean, you have to kind of think that through to see what all the different possibilities are. And it definitely would impact that, and you'd have to figure out how long have they been doing it. How long have they changed their eating habits based on knowledge of their genetics? That's probably a whole PhD thesis if you're interested in pursuing this area. To ask that question for people who do get that kind of information, how does that change their eating habits? We're actually going to cover that in the course because we did do that kind of work. And I did have a PhD student do that, where we compared the effects of giving people DNA-based dietary advice versus standard recommendations. And there were some changes that were much greater when people knew their genetics. And we'll probably cover that after the midterm. So recall bias, again, doesn't factor in here because having the gene doesn't affect your memory, doesn't affect your recollection, right? At least it's not biologically plausible. CYP genotype does not affect your memory or recall. So we see the effect in one group, but we don't see it in the other. And that's why, again, almost every question that I've been asking you from one group, you have to refer to the other group to be able to answer that in its entirety. All right, so that was the first study of its kind, and that was over 15 years ago. There had since been others who have replicated this. This is a couple of years later. This group in Italy did a prospective study. And rather than looking at heart attack, they looked at the risk of developing hypertension, which we had postulated is kind of the intermediate pathway. And so even though their cup sizes are a little bit different and the categories are a little bit different, nevertheless, you see the same pattern, right? And they wanted to figure out and solve the whole mess that was coffee and hypertension. And a lot of organizations don't make definitive recommendations on coffee and hypertension because the people that sit on the panel are expert scientists. And they have their own populations and they do their own studies. And some of them have reported that coffee is actually protective. They've just seen this. Whereas others doing it in a different population with different people see an increased risk. And so they meet together at these annual meetings and they argue back and forth. Everyone believes their own data and they say, nope, coffee doesn't do anything. And those who in their own studies see a protective effect, they're like, if coffee was so bad against hypertension, how on earth are we seeing a protective effect? No one's talking about genetics at all. At least they haven't until very recently. So, again, when it comes to hypertension, coffee is either good for you or bad for you, depending on your genes. The same group also looked at pre-diabetes and impaired fasting glucose and saw the same thing, that increasing cups of coffee increased the risk of impaired fasting glucose only in the slow metabolizers. Yet another group, this is in the United States, looked at a couple of genes. Remember I talked about the adenosine receptor? The adenosine receptor is the main target of caffeine action. Right? CYP1A2 affects the pharmacokinetics of caffeine. The adenosine receptor, the ADORA A2A, affects the pharmacodynamics, how it acts in the cell. And what they found was that after a carbohydrate load or carbohydrate with caffeine, that only the C allele carriers had impaired clearance of blood glucose. So the dark bars, you see it's a higher area under the curve. It didn't drop as low. And this is just kind of an acute study. And yet another study, this is one done by folks in Brazil, where they also looked at physical activity, and then they looked at spikes in blood pressure. Also showed the same thing. And lastly, in terms of performance, so this was work that a former PhD student of mine, Nancy Guest, she's a sport dietitian. She did a randomized controlled clinical trial looking at caffeine and endurance performance. And here we thought that slow metabolizers might benefit more, right? Because caffeine is used as an ergogenic aid. We thought maybe the slow metabolizers might actually benefit. But that's not what we found. This is just the journal that we published this in. So as part of Nancy's doctoral thesis, she did this randomized controlled clinical trial with different doses per, those should be milligram per kilogram body weight. Right? So 4 milligrams per kilogram body weight is roughly the equivalent of about 3 cups of coffee for average sized person. And so athletes, these were all elite athletes that were recruited, and they were recruited to do a 10-kilometer cycling time trial. Right? And the faster they did it, that meant the greater the performance. So here, with the fast metabolizers, you can see that with increasing doses of caffeine, the performance was actually improved. Everyone had all 3 doses. So if you're a fast metabolizer, it's the same person that did it at a different time. And it was all done in a randomized order. The slow metabolizers, no effect. And remember I showed you what we thought possibly the CCs, in some cases, at least with something acute like performance, call those ultra slow, their performance was actually impaired. It took them about 2.5 minutes longer to complete a 10-kilometer cycling time trial while they were on caffeine. And what we postulated was a mechanism is that everyone benefits from the acute stimulating effects of caffeine. Right? So as soon as you take caffeine, you're wired, you're amped, you're jacked, your pain threshold goes up, meaning you can endure a higher level of pain, and that's why some athletes can actually go through that burn. But what happens is with slow metabolizers, caffeine starts to build in the system, and they're not able to clear it, and that causes vasoconstriction, so decreased blood flow to the muscles. So while they benefit from that initial stimulating effects, by the time the 10-kilometer cycling time trial is done, they are much more fatigued because there's less blood flow, less oxygen going to the muscles. And so yet another benefit of a slow metabolizer is the performance is actually improved. So that's kind of nice to see because all across the board, not only are they okay in terms of heart health, prediabetes, hypertension, but even performance. Whereas slow metabolizers, it's not even going to help their performance, so it definitely increases the risk of other conditions. So again, this is a bit of a downer. Caffeine has the wrong effects on the unlucky 10%. That was in the London Times in the UK. That 10%, the unlucky, are the CC metabolizers. Because in our population, again, it was roughly that same distribution. This is a study that, and just before we take a brief break, because I'm going to go a little bit longer, probably closer to 3:30 today. I was approached by this group in Italy who, actually, sorry, it was a group in Brazil that wanted me to give a talk on caffeine and kidney function, which I didn't really know a lot about. But then I found that this paper that was by the same group that did the hypertension study with genetics, that they published this paper looking at factors associated with glomerular filtration rate, which is a measure of kidney function. And so I contacted them and said, hey, I saw your review paper and you identified coffee as a risk factor for impaired kidney function. As he showed that, 1 to 3 cups increases the risk and greater than 3 increases it more. And I said, I know you have genetics on these people, the DNA, because, we saw your study. Are you interested in collaborating to see, if there's an association there? And so he sent me the genetic data, and actually Dr. Madavi, who's going to give you guys a guest lecture later on, we just got this paper accepted for publication in JAMA Network Open, where we showed that even with kidney function, you see, so this was the data, it was a cross-sectional study, over 1,000 individuals. Actually, there was a prospective element to it as well. They were followed up for a few years. And you can see here, in terms of the risk of hyperfiltration, which is a measure of impaired kidney function, that the effect is much greater. In fact, it's significantly greater in the slow metabolizers, but no significant effect in the AA genotype. So right now it says unpublished data, but it's something that's going to be coming out probably sometime in November or December of this year. So late-breaking research, just letting you know about this now. And when you look here at the glomerular filtration rate, again, with the fast metabolizers, increasing cups of coffee, there's hardly any effect at all. But slow metabolizers, you see this strong dose-response curve. So heart attack, hypertension, prediabetes, blood pressure, performance, and kidney health all have consistent patterns in terms of it's okay up to a certain level for fast metabolizers. Slow metabolizers really need to limit their intake. So after a lot of this data came out, another colleague of mine actually in Italy, Dr. Di Caterina, who used to be the president of the International Society of Nutrigenetics and Nutrigenomics, we came up with this consensus article that talked about how we can use the data now that the evidence is growing from different aspects, different study designs, and different health outcomes, to come up with recommendations and genetic algorithms that can be used to make DNA-specific recommendations. Now, I'm just going to show you, for the sake of balance and transparency, the one study that did not show an effect of CYP1A2 on coffee. And so this was published in JAMA Internal Medicine. And when we saw this paper, we're like, oh, okay, well, maybe the effect isn't as robust as we thought. And but then we read the paper carefully, and we're like, whoa, this has some serious issues. And so there were 5 letters to the editor that were written. Ours was one of them. So we submitted a letter to the editor highlighting some of the limitations. So it was, you see, Nancy Gastry was one of the authors, Viviana, and myself. And we wrote why there are fatal flaws in the study that preclude making this conclusion that genetics is not important. Plus, again, 4 other letters. Some that pointed out the same limitations that we did, others pointed out other fatal flaws. And on top of that, the open access part of it had 9 different comments from different investigators. But really submitting a letter to the editor, because that gets peer reviewed, that's really the best way to address concerns that you see in the study. And so for us, we highlighted 3 critical flaws. When I say critical, it means all you need is really 1. Those are really 3 fatal flaws. And if you have 1 fatal flaw, right, if you didn't do the right kind of adjustment, you cannot make that conclusion. They had 3, which was astounding. But again, they used the UK Biobank, which is about 500,000 people. We argue that it doesn't matter if you use 50 million people. Right? If you're not measuring something correctly, or you measure something incorrectly, it doesn't matter how big your sample size is. So when you look at what's wrong with that study, this was the most astonishing. They included decaffeinated coffee drinkers, which are not a trivial part of the population. And so when you look at So remember, decaffeinated coffee does not contain caffeine, right? So if you're going to include decaf, you might as well include tea and water and milk and orange juice and anything else. So their cups were not just of caffeinated coffee drinking. It was just cups of liquid that people consumed. And the more cups that you're consuming that don't have caffeine, you're not going to see a difference by the gene, because the gene is not metabolizing anything, and you're totally going to dampen any effect that you see. And that's exactly what happened here. You cannot include decaffeinated cups of coffee, and also not even including other sources of caffeine. And then the choice of the variants. They looked at a pooled genetic risk score that for some reason has, I don't know how they came up with this, they don't actually explain it, but they did just look at CYP1A2, which we know is the main determinant of of caffeine metabolism. And then pooling all causes of death. Again, there have been some studies suggesting that caffeine might protect against breast cancer and maybe other forms of cancer. And so even though they had data specifically for cardiovascular disease, they put all causes of death together. So if caffeine doesn't impact risk of cancer, and might even protect against it, then again, by adding those causes of death, you're completely diluting the effect of caffeine on heart disease. So you diluted the exposure by including all kinds of other beverages, and then you diluted the outcome by including all kinds of other causes of death. It's just astonishing that they did that. So, again, Nutrigenomics can be helpful, but you have to be careful to make sure you understand the study design. So some of those papers could be ones that you're assigned to. I chose not to assign that one UK Biobank paper because I felt it was very important for me to point out the limitations, and I feel sorry for any group that got that and didn't capture those 3 critical flaws. So just to keep it fair. So the genetic variant, you have to know that it does actually modulate the relationship. You don't just look at random genetic risk scores and looking at effect size. You have to make sure that the right exposures are being captured and that they're not being diluted, they're being captured in the right way, and the right outcomes are being assessed, right? They look at all-cause mortality, even motor vehicle accidents. Well, what does caffeine and CYP1A2 have to do with motor vehicle accidents? If anything, they could protect against it. We don't know, right? But you're diluting that. So in terms of future directions in this area, there was this review paper here in just a couple of years ago that talks about inter-individual variation and health outcomes for coffee, and just some of the issues that relate to other health outcomes. Because even though coffee might increase the risk of heart disease, as I mentioned, there's some evidence that it might actually be protective against some forms of cancer. So if you're interested in just learning more about the coffee and health effects, this is an article that you can consider, but it's not required reading and you're not going to be tested on this. So let's just take a short 5-minute break, and we'll carry on with the last bit of this lecture. That this is still possibly recall bias or residual confounding. And my answer was, if this effect was similar, it doesn't have to be as striking, but if it was a similar pattern from here to here, that could tell us a couple of things. One, yes, it is possible that that's due to residual confounding, because heavy coffee drinkers, maybe they're doing something else, we just didn't report it, that's why we see them in this group and that group. But what else could it tell us? If this group had a similar pattern as this, in addition to that, now we're no longer able to rule out residual confounding. What else does it tell us?
That for both whatever genotype, over 4 cups of coffee has increased risk, relative risk.
Yeah, and what does that tell us about coffee, caffeine, whatever?
The genotype doesn't matter. It will increase myocardial risk of infarction.
Yeah, then the genotype doesn't matter, and what were we using the genotype to determine? Partly.
Recommendations,
Of what specifically?
like coffee combinations, say that no one should drink more than 4 cups if they will.
But CYP1A2 doesn't metabolize coffee, it metabolizes
Caffeine.
caffeine. So, if we see a similar pattern here as we do here, yeah, we can no longer say that it's not residual confounding. We can no longer say that recall bias is not a problem, because it can, right? Because the ratio of cases and controls over there, it still shows a higher risk. But it's possible that it's the caffeine, that effect is real. Something in coffee increases the risk of heart disease, but it's not caffeine, right? So if we're confident that recall bias is not a problem, residual confounding is not a problem, yet we see this increased risk in both genotypes, what we would say is it's just not due to caffeine. Because just pretend you did another gene here, right? Like you, MTHFR, right? And you have CCs versus T allele carriers with coffee. What would you expect to see? Pretty much a similar pattern, right? Because unless folate is found in coffee and folate metabolism increases heart disease, you would not expect the MTHFR genotype to modify the effects of coffee, right? It means it's not folate. So likewise, if there's no difference between those two, it means maybe it's not caffeine. But again, we wouldn't be able to rule out residual confounding or those other factors. All right. Now, I just want to give one last example of gene-diet interaction, and that's related to vitamin C. So, the very first clinical trial that was ever done was done by Dr. James Lind, who was charged with trying to figure out why scurvy killed more sailors in the British Royal Navy than all enemies combined. They died mainly of scurvy. And so he conducted this clinical trial where he randomized, so he got, I think 2, 4, 6, 8 or 10 or 12 sailors, and who started showing signs of scurvy. And then he randomized them. 2 of them got a couple of drops of sulfuric acid. 2 of them got a little bit of seawater. 2 of them didn't get anything. And 2 of them got some lime juice. And shortly after, all of them died, except for the 2 that got lime juice. So he reasoned that there is something in lime juice that protects against scurvy. Of those 2, one of them recovered very quickly, and the other one took a little bit longer to recover. And this is why kind of an old-fashioned term for British sailors is limeys. That's where that comes from, because they then had to include lime as part of the ration. And so he identified something in citrus, and later on, eventually, we were able to determine that it was vitamin C. And so, again, another former PhD student of mine, Leah Cahill, who's now a professor at Dalhousie University. We were interested in the metabolism of vitamin C and why some people respond differently from others. And so the first thing we wanted to do is just look at, well, just how common is vitamin C deficiency? We tend to think of this as kind of an ancient disease. We think nobody here really, has scurvy these days anymore. But we didn't know. And so we said, well, let's figure it out first. And it turns out that it's actually more common than we thought. So we recruited these ostensibly healthy young adults, mostly kind of university-age students, not unlike yourselves. And we found that roughly 1 in 7 have serum levels that are considered deficient, where you see the first signs of scurvy, less than 11 micromolar. And a further third had suboptimal levels, and only half had really good levels, optimal levels of ascorbic acid. So that was the first thing to document. And then the next is, again, these are all individuals in their 20s, relatively lean body mass, and fairly good blood pressure and other biomarkers. But you can see already, even in their 20s, they had signs of cardiometabolic dysfunction, right? Greater BMI, greater waist circumference, higher blood pressure, and the biggest effect is with CRP, pro-inflammatory cytokine, where those with adequate levels had a value of 1, which is good, almost a 50% higher level in the suboptimal, and a 2-fold higher level of CRP in those who had deficient levels. So again, already in their 20s, we're seeing signs of cardiometabolic dysfunction. The real question we wanted to ask is, again, does genetics play an important role? And so this was a study that we published way back in 2009 in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition. And you can see there was a corresponding and accompanying editorial where the journal felt this is particularly interesting research because we're now using genetics to identify who is most susceptible to vitamin C deficiency. And here what we showed is first using a population of European descent. We focused on the GSTT1 enzyme. So I don't know if any of you have taken HMB 311 or 312 or the lab course there. This is one of the ones that it's tested for. GST is involved in the recycling of dehydroascorbic acid into ascorbic acid. So some people just lack that enzyme. They just don't have it. And it's okay because that kind of confers some other advantages. But for those who don't have it, they are not able to recycle dehydroascorbic acid into ascorbic acid. And so we looked at those who were getting adequate amounts of vitamin C, right? They're meeting the recommended daily allowance, versus those who are not getting it. And as you can see, the GST, the polymorphism, is a deletion polymorphism. So there's a big chunk of that gene that's just missing. So you either have it or you don't. All right? It's not a SNP, it's an insertion deletion. So those who have the null genotype, meaning it's deleted, if they're not getting adequate amounts of vitamin C, their blood levels drop. And this is what we would expect, right? You're not getting enough vitamin C, your blood levels are plummeting. And that's, again, kind of normal. What's interesting is those who have the functional version of this gene. Even if they're getting just what little vitamin C they're getting, even if they're not meeting fully the RDA, they're able to preserve or conserve what little vitamin C they're getting. So this was shown in a Caucasian population. We also replicated that in an East Asian cohort, those of East Asian ancestry. And you can see there's the exact same phenomenon. Those who have the null genotype, blood levels drop. Those who have the functioning version, it's preserved. What's interesting and what's different between these two ethnic groups is just how common the null genotype is. And it's found in only about 20% of Europeans, but roughly half of East Asians have that null genotype. Now, this is important for a number of reasons. First of all, you might argue, well, it's of greater relevance to those of East Asian ancestry, but you still need to know as an individual, right? If you're of European descent, even though there's a lower likelihood that you have the deletion, this is 20%, right? So 1 in 5 people are going to have this. It's not trivial. So even though it applies to a greater proportion of the population, you still have to know as an individual, do you have this or don't. The other important thing that it highlights is that ethnicity doesn't really matter, right? Your genetic ancestry. Because this is sometimes a comment or a criticism of some genetic testing companies, and a lot of the research in this field has been done on those of European descent. That's a valid argument initially, but then we have to look at the genetic markers, right? Maybe so that applies when you're looking at, disease-associated genes, and maybe there's different linkage patterns in some ethnic groups. That's a possibility. But when you're looking at a functional polymorphism that has a known biological function, it doesn't matter if it's in an Asian, an African, a European, a Latin American, it should have the same effect, right? CYP1A2 metabolizes caffeine. Doesn't matter who it's expressed in, it has the same effect. So that type of phenomenon, again, addresses a lot of those kinds of perceived limitations. I say perceived because, again, it's like food frequency questionnaires in coffee. Oh, yeah, FFQs are no good. Well, they are good for coffee. And here you say, oh, well, studies have been done in Europeans, how do I know it doesn't apply to, other ethnic groups? Well, it has the same biological function, so it doesn't really matter. Okay, finally getting to the topic of today's lecture, which is food intolerances. And I wanted to focus on initially 2 major ones, one being lactose and one being gluten. If we have time, I might trickle on to next week's lecture. I might try to squeeze in another intolerance. But to start off with gluten intolerance, again, over the years, a gluten-free diet has been kind of popularized, mainly by a lot of professional athletes and celebrities, and everybody and their grandmother was going gluten-free. I think in the supermarket now you can pretty much find more gluten-free products than gluten-containing products. It has been shooting up and overtaking a lot of these other types of fad diets, than the low-carb diet or the low-fat diet. But gluten itself is a protein that's found in specific types of grains, namely wheat, barley, and rye. Oats, technically, pure oats don't have gluten, but there's a high risk of cross-contamination, and so if anyone is on a strict gluten-free diet, they generally avoid oats as well. But there are related proteins that elicit the same type of reaction. You don't have to worry about this. I'm not going to ask you about the amino acid sequence of that, but when you look at the effects of gluten, and the main condition is really celiac disease, sometimes called celiac sprue, old-fashioned term, but the villi of the small intestine usually are nicely defined, where you get these finger-like projections, and we see that in A and A, whereas in B, they're flattened. Right? So the villi, the small intestine, they get flattened because they get attacked, and it's an autoimmune condition. Right? So the body is basically attacking itself. And then you get a decrease in absorption because you have less surface area. So with celiac disease, this actually it's estimated to be about 1% in the population, mainly of European ancestry. It's much lower in other ethnic groups, but not non-existent. It does exist in some ethnic groups. And so the symptoms are actually quite varied, and this is what makes celiac disease so difficult to diagnose and to pinpoint. GI discomfort is kind of the classic symptom. And there's generally two forms of celiac disease. At least it's identified in two different populations. One in children, where usually it's identified because the pediatrician recognizes that they have these classic GI symptoms, constant diarrhea, failure to thrive, and they test them for celiac and they identify that. Then there's another group, usually women in their 40s, sometimes 50s, of a second phase where it's a slightly different version or variant of celiac disease. And it doesn't present with the same classical symptoms. I was giving a talk at the Massachusetts Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, and the dietitian was sitting at my table. She was in her 60s, and she said, I just got diagnosed with celiac disease. She's a dietitian, and she just got diagnosed with celiac disease. She had no clue that she had this. And the way she discovered it was she had a bone density scan. And the doctor said, your bones are like paper thin. She was planning on going on a ski trip, and he said, absolutely not. There's no way you're going skiing. Look at your bones. There's no way. Center for Celiac Testing, she had celiac disease. So bone demineralization is one of them. Basically, an impairment in the absorption of all kinds of nutrients, right? Because the villi are flattened. So you're not getting enough of a lot of nutrients, even though you're consuming them. Right? She was a dietitian, she was eating a pretty healthy diet, but her body was not absorbing a lot of these nutrients. And so that's another reason why about 90% of cases of celiac disease go undiagnosed. It's because it's so difficult to pinpoint the cause, because it manifests in so many different types of symptoms. Not just GI, joint pains, skin rashes, neurological symptoms, including seizures, respiratory problems. Again, the list is so different, right? And oftentimes these patients are just referred to one specialist over another, and they never actually, those specialists don't actually think of celiac disease, unless they're referred to a gastroenterologist. They're one of the only specialists that do that. I know someone who had seizures, and they were referred to a neurologist, and they told them that they ruled out epilepsy, and they ruled out a tumor at MRIs, and they said it's basically all in your head. These seizures, these convulsions are just in your mind. And it turns out it was caused by gluten and celiac disease. So celiac disease does have a specific diagnosis, and usually it starts with antibody testing, serology. So you do a blood test, and the gold standard now is TTG, which stands for tissue transglutaminase. EMA is not really used that often, but you have to be consuming gluten. So if someone suspects they have celiac disease, they should not cut out gluten until they actually at least get a blood test, because you have to be consuming at least a little bit of gluten before your antibody levels can go to be an elevated level. And then usually that's followed by a biopsy, where you look at the small intestine and you see the flattening of the villi. But a lot of people, once they get that positive blood test, because it's so specific, they're just like, they just cut out gluten, and they don't need that biopsy confirmation. Now, the relevance to this course, of course, is that there's a strong genetic component to this. More than strong, it's an essential component. So the human leukocyte antigen, or the HLA gene region, has a number of polymorphisms that give rise to a risk variant that, just like CYP1A2 alone does not cause celiac disease. Other factors are required, and then obviously the exposure to gluten is what causes a lot of these adverse health conditions that occur. So when you look at the HLA gene region, it's in the major histocompatibility complex, the MHC region in chromosome 6. It's involved in a number of autoimmune diseases, so that's why a lot of patients who have celiac disease often have other autoimmune disorders. In terms of the risk variants, there's a different nomenclature. So even though we have RS numbers, specific SNPs that cause these variants, this is a bit of kind of an old-fashioned way, and a lot of gastroenterologists still use this terminology, the DQ or DQ8 variant. For those of you who have seen a sample of the nutrigenomics report, you'll know that we look at 6 SNPs that predict DQ2, DQ8, and actually DQ7. And so gluten can bind to those. The heterodimer just means that one part is DQ2, one part is DQ8, which is necessary but not sufficient for celiac disease. So just because you have these risk variants doesn't mean that you have celiac disease. So it's not diagnostic. And so when you look at what happens and why we can measure tissue transglutaminase, remember this is the enzyme that in those who have celiac disease, once they're exposed to gluten in wheat, barley, or rye, that protein is broken down into smaller peptides that are still unique to gluten. And once they cross the small intestinal barrier, they activate the tissue transglutaminase, and that's what is measured. And then you get this cascade of inflammatory reactions. And in terms of the genetics, this was a study that looked at the different risk variants. So if you look at the 6 SNPs that are involved, that are in the HLA gene region, it depends on what combination of those SNPs you have. And I think we had looked at over like 140 combinations that can be used to categorize people into risk. So those who have the DQ2, 2.2 or 2.5 homozygotes have the highest risk, and compared to those who don't have it, that's like a 50-fold higher risk. But again, it's not diagnostic, so it doesn't mean that it's a very high risk, but not definitive. And those who have a medium risk, again, significantly higher risk. Those with the low, we can't say it's no risk, right? So even those who don't have those genetic variants, there's a very tiny subset of the population that has been diagnosed with celiac disease, but don't have those HLA risk variants. But it's probably another SNP in that gene region. It's just not the 6 major ones that we look at. And here it's important to point out that if anyone's ever done 23andMe testing, they only look at 2 SNPs, which are the 2 most common ones. But what's very unfortunate is that if you don't have those 2 SNPs, they will tell you you do not have the genetics for celiac disease. So the person that I was telling you about that had seizures, had 23andMe done, and just was never thinking about celiac disease because they remember 23andMe telling them you don't have celiac disease. You don't have the genes for celiac disease, which is dangerous, and I'm still really astonished as to why they're able to still do that. So usually you use genetics to rule it out, even though again there's a very, very low chance of possibly having it without those genetic variants. Exposure to gluten is also known to be an important determinant, just like food allergies, which hopefully we can get to, there's no way to get to today. We'll talk about it next week. IgE-mediated food allergies. There's some genetics involved, but it's largely based on timing of exposure. And so this is actually consistent with a lot of pediatric organizations that suggest, 4 to 6 weeks is the best time to expose infants to wheat and barley and other types of grains. And this study that was published in JAMA showed that if you expose them too early, that greatly increases the risk in those who have the genetics, right? And if you delay it too long, that's also not good. So there's almost this sweet spot, this window of exposure that seems to be ideal for reducing the risk of celiac disease in those who have that genetic propensity for it. So I mentioned the diagnostic approach starts with blood measures. So normally you would measure TTG, and that's usually the IgA form of it, because most people have an IgA. A small percentage of people just have an IgA deficiency. They just don't produce any immunoglobulin A. And in those individuals, you have to use a more expensive test, which is an IgG form of the antibodies. But usually, when you have someone who runs a celiac panel, you would run total IgAs just to make sure that they're not deficient, and then you would run the TTG. And that's kind of the first step, and if it's positive, it's followed up by a biopsy. That's to have a definitive diagnosis of celiac disease. Now, you can do that in everybody and screen everyone this way, or you can do genotyping, because only about 30% of the population, and again, this is higher in Europeans than in other ethnic groups, have the genetics that's required. So those who do not have the HLA DQ2 or 8, with or without the DQ7, you can effectively rule out celiac disease. So this just makes it a bit more efficient, non-invasive genetic test, and follow the diagnostic algorithm that way. In fact, again, you don't have to memorize this figure. It's really meant to illustrate that the Mayo Clinic uses that as well. You can see here in their diagnostic algorithm, you have your patient, depending on whether they have normal or elevated IgA, and depending on their TTG antibody levels, you can determine whether you can rule out celiac disease or whether or not it's a possible positive. In some cases where it might be negative, but there's other symptoms, you do genetic testing. And if that's negative, then you can rule out celiac disease. If it's positive, then it's still possible, and you want to still proceed with a biopsy. And the same thing at this level here, DNA typing, that's essentially using genotyping to determine whether or not celiac disease is still a possibility. So, again, one of my former PhD students, Joseph Jamnik, he actually just finished his last year of medical school here at U of T, together with Dr. Jenkins. We wanted to determine the prevalence of of celiac disease in Canada, because it had never been done before. We're actually surprised. We're based on data in the US, data in the UK, and we published this paper back in 2017 in British Medical Journal Open, where we showed that looking at antibody levels in stored blood samples, that first of all, consistent with some other populations, about 35% of the population had the risk variant. And again, that was more common in those of European descent, less so in those of East Asian descent. And about 1% had celiac disease, which is consistent with the known prevalence. And also what was consistent with others is that roughly 90% were undiagnosed. So meaning of those 1% that had the antibodies that were screening celiac disease, 90% of them in their questionnaire, when they're asked, have you ever been diagnosed with celiac disease or any disease, they wrote no. So they're walking around with celiac disease and they still don't know about that. And this was in 2017. Now, it's still high because, kind of surprising, despite the fact that there's so many gluten-free products that are available. But for anyone to truly go gluten-free, it's pretty tough. I don't know if anyone has tried it, but not just cutting out pasta and bread. I mean, gluten is in everything. The next time you eat something, whatever it is for dinner, I'm going to bet every one of you, unless you are gluten-free strictly, you're going to have gluten in that meal. Anything that has any sauce, just about every sauce has gluten in it. Next time you're in the supermarket, which I know you guys don't do, but if you are, look at any kind of sauce. You might find some that's labeled gluten-free, and that's obviously being marketed to those individuals. But soya sauce, teriyaki sauce, most salad dressings, just about everything contains gluten. Although again, there's a lot of options now that are gluten-free, but again, it's surprising that still, despite the widespread availability and the popularization of gluten-free foods, that it's still fairly common. So when we publish this, again, the majority of Torontonians with celiac disease don't know they have it, and it goes undiagnosed in 90% of cases. So when it comes to genetics, there are different risk types. And remember I said the DQ 2.2 is a higher risk. So here's a case where you could have, a couple, neither of them have celiac disease, right? One of them has the low risk, which effectively is the no risk. And the other one has, medium risk, but he doesn't have celiac disease. Based on their genetics, every one of their offspring is going to have the genetics for the highest risk. It doesn't mean that all their children are going to have celiac disease, but here are two people who don't have celiac disease. And every child they have, or ever will have the highest risk, meaning they can have one or more children with celiac disease. And they probably be scratching their heads, and they won't even think about it because they don't have a family history, right? There's this misconception that, family history is so important. Here's a case where this heterozygote, the 2.2 and DQ7, is one of the highest risk genotypes. Now, let's look at the flip scenario where the parents have that, the couple, right? There are two people who not only have the high risk, they both have celiac disease, okay? Let's say they met at a gluten-free party, right? Had some gluten-free beer, and had some kids. They're probably worried and anxious that their kids are going to have celiac disease, right? But there's a 25% chance that the child will just not have the genetics required. Right? Remember, beer has celiac. No, it doesn't have celiac, it has gluten. 25% chance that the child's going to inherit the DQ7. Obviously, a 75% chance that that a child will have a different combination of either high or medium. But again, here's a case where family history is not really that useful, right, compared to precise genotyping. This was an interesting study that was conducted in Italy where they found skeletal remains in, I think it was somewhere in northern Italy, where based on the bones there was signs of malnutrition, which seemed odd because, and obviously signs of osteoporosis, the bones were very frail. It's odd that there was signs of malnutrition because that person seemed to be affluent. Right? They were buried with a lot of gold and jewelry. And so at that time, it was bizarre that someone like that would not have adequate access to food. They were genotyped, and sure enough, they have the homozygous for the 2.5, which is another one of those high-risk variants. So this was just kind of one of those paleoarchaeological type studies that it was kind of interesting. It's not causal, but it's just suggestive that maybe this person had celiac. because it's actually fairly prevalent in Italy, of all places, right? Where everyone loves pasta, but celiac disease is actually fairly prevalent. There's another condition called non-celiac gluten sensitivity, where celiac disease has been ruled out, but people still seem to have this reaction to gluten-containing foods. And the jury is still out on whether this condition called NCGS, non-celiac gluten sensitivity, whether it even exists, and what is it that actually, what's the pathophysiology of it. Some argue that it's FODMAPs, fructooligosaccharides, that are found in some of these foods. They're also rich in gluten, so it could be the cause of that. So there is some evidence, though, that these risk genotypes that are found more commonly in celiac disease, remember about 30% of the whole population has the risk variants, but 100% of people with celiac disease have it. Right? So having the gene doesn't mean you're going to get celiac disease, but having celiac disease means you do have that risk variant. And NCGS seems to be somewhere in the middle. So it does seem to be slightly higher. Remember that table I showed you before with fast and slow metabolizers among the cases and controls? And if it's more common in cases, that means the gene might be associated with the disease. Similarly here, right? Looks like the HLA risk variants might double your risk of celiac disease. And so when it comes to some of the symptoms, this is just going back to those conditions for celiac disease. Again, the NCGS seems to be similar to celiac disease, but it looks to be a little bit more prevalent, although there's no diagnostic test for that. And we put a question mark on HLA because we don't really know if that's the basis. So remember I was telling you about someone that I knew had celiac disease, and they effectively, in their minds, ruled it out because they they had a 23andMe test, and the 23andMe test basically told them that they don't have that. This person used to have joint pains in the mornings, typically, had kind of rashes on her elbows, and just had a kind of a dull pain. He just thought it was kind of a normal thing in life. And a couple of years ago, started having seizures and couldn't figure out what that was, what was causing the seizures, and they were ruled out. So last year, when I was giving this lecture, and as I was talking through the different symptoms, and I also mentioned seizures, it occurred to me, I'm like, this sounds like somebody I know. And that's my wife, who happens to be half Italian, half German. And so I went home and I said to her, are we sure you ruled out celiac disease? And she said, yeah, remember 23andMe? I'm like, can you pull it up? Sure enough, she opened up her account. There it is, in big bold letters. You do not have the genes for celiac disease. So I said to her, well, what did your nutrigenomics report say? Because we did that, a couple years before that. She opened it up, and it says you have the highest risk. Because we test for the DQ7 as well as which 23andMe does not. And I'm like, it says you have the highest risk. And she's like, yeah, but it's your company and this is 23andMe. So she thought, they're more credible. And I said, okay, listen, she has an appointment with her doctor, and I said, tell your doctor, it's at the Cleveland Clinic, tell her to run the celiac panel. And so usually, it's a kind of a concierge medical thing that we had, kind of was like a last resort, right? Even though we're in this universal healthcare system, if you have the means and you're desperate, you're going to pay these extra services to go to these specialized clinics. So she spoke to her doctor, and she said, she knows me, I met her a couple of times, And she said, oh yeah, and can you run the celiac panel too? And then she's like, oh, why do you want to do that? And she said, well, Ahmed suggested, I should probably do it. And so she was even kind of reluctant to do it. And none of her other doctors ever suggested doing that. So she ran the celiac panel, and about a week later, she got a call from the nurse practitioner who said, we got your antibody levels back. A diagnosis of celiac disease is TTG anything over 10. Hers were 140. And what's crazy is that study that we did, that we published in 2017, she was one of the participants. We recruited them way back in 2005. So when I first met her, she participated in the study. So she was one of those 90%. But we couldn't identify her because that would be unethical to de-identify. But I later looked on, the case reports of those who had that, and it just has de-identified data, right? So it has date of birth, and sure enough, it's, she's one of those people. So she didn't get a biopsy until like 6 months later, because that's how long it takes. And I told her, just cut out gluten, even though you're not supposed to, right? Because I knew that there's different forms of it. And even if you don't have that villus atrophy, you can still have different forms of celiac disease. So she cut out gluten right away, and 2 days later, she's like, I don't mean to jinx this, but remember the rashes I had on my elbow that I just thought was normal? They're gone. And a couple of days later, she'd have just joint pains. She's like 5 or 6 years younger than me, so still, young and shouldn't be feeling like an old lady, which is how she would describe it. And then also the seizures just disappeared. So she's been to neurologists, rheumatologists for the joint pains, blood specialists, because there's indication of poor circulation, all these different specialists that really drain the healthcare system, right? Because none of them ever thought of celiac disease. She was never really referred to a gastroenterologist because she didn't really have obvious pains or symptoms of GI. So that was just last year. So if I gave this lecture last year, or when I did, it was a totally different lecture. I've actually never told this story until now. So we obviously had our children tested, just because my son is kind of slim, a little bit too skinny. He's only 11 years old. He likes to show off his six-pack, and I'm like, an 11-year-old should not have a six-pack. He doesn't eat very much. So we're actually worried that maybe he had celiac disease. But we were able to rule that out for both of them. And yeah, so that is that story. Again, part of me feels a little embarrassed that I'm in this field and been doing research all this time, and something in my own household that we were not able to detect. But again, I think part of that was having been thrown for a bit of a loop where, she at least ruled it out in her mind because of, the 23andMe data, and the fact that, again, we rely on our healthcare system and our specialists to at least propose putting in the right kinds of tests. What was interesting is, so this happened around last November. At that time, the very day that I took our kids to Life Labs to get tested, and we didn't know this until a couple of days later, is when the Ontario government started covering the test. So right now, it's covered by OHIP. But a year ago, it was not. I mean, it's only like $60 or $70, right? I mean, we paid it anyways, even though we shouldn't have paid it. But for a lot of people, that's not insignificant, and some people can't afford that. And more importantly, a lot of gluten, and this is something that we've discovered, a lot of gluten-free foods are a lot more expensive than gluten-containing foods. So it's actually really good, and they did it as a trial 6 month, right? And for whatever reason, I guess there's a lot of lobbying that was going on, that they've extended that. So even up till now, if your physician refers you to get an antibody test, it will now be covered. Whereas last year, you'd have to pay like, $70 for it. But I can tell you that a lot of people still are, physicians are still reluctant to do this. So again, my wife told her parents, and then her dad was like, okay, maybe I should, even though he's like late 70s, maybe I should get tested as well, because sometimes you have certain things you don't know if you necessarily have it. And he went to his doctor, and the doctor basically said, no, I'm not going to give you a test because you don't need it. Look at you, you're in your 70s, you're fine, and off he went. Even though he has the medium risk in his, from our report. So at a webinar that I gave on this topic to a group of dietitians, my message was that if you or any of your patients have any symptom that does not have a cause, a known cause, right? It doesn't have to be gastrointestinal, because again, there's all these neurological symptoms. And neurologists, one of my good friends is a neurologist, and I told him the story. He's like, yeah, we never test for celiac disease. We just don't think about that as a possible cause of seizures, convulsions. Imagine the first time seeing someone called 911. All of a sudden, she's like having a seizure. And you think at that age, maybe it's like a brain tumor or something like that, because usually epilepsy happens early on. So again, if you or anyone you know has any kind of health condition that does not have a known cause, push to have your family doctor order a celiac test, because again, 90%, all the people who have celiac disease, 9 out of 10 of them are walking around and don't know they have it. And again, it's kind of biphasic. There's the extreme form that happens in childhood, but then a more milder form that happens later on in late adulthood. All right, so let's go quickly now through, try to finish up in the next 10 minutes. Let me see if I need to extend my parking here. Oh, I'm good still. All right. So lactose intolerance, and the only reason why I'm speaking about gluten and lactose is those are the only two food intolerances that seem to have a clear genetic basis. Right? Try to get to these so-called food sensitivity tests, but they're a little bit kind of wonky and don't really have a strong science behind them. But lactose intolerance is essentially an inability to break down lactose, and it's age dependent. So it happens usually around 7, 8, 9, 10 years old. Right? We're born with the genetic variant that either predicts lactose intolerance or allows us to metabolize lactose. But it's not until a certain age that we begin to display those symptoms if we have the genetic variant for it. And so lactose is a simple sugar that's made up of glucose and galactose. And so those who are not able to metabolize it, the lactose ends up going into the gut and gets fermented. And there's a polymorphism in the lactase gene or the neighboring MCM6 gene. And so here's where it's not really clear if that polymorphism is in the promoter region of the lactase gene or if it's actually in the neighboring MCM6 gene, but clearly functional significance because it's right there, the gene that expresses the enzyme that breaks it down. So if you have this polymorphism, at a certain age, you are unable to produce enough lactase. And so the undigested lactose isn't absorbed because it's too big, and it ends up getting fermented in the colon by bacteria, and that fermentation produces gas and water. And that's basically why you get diarrhea and flatulence, right? It gets fermented. Now, there is a way of gradually, even if you have the gene for lactose intolerance, there's a way of gradually increasing your tolerance to lactose. If you drink a little bit of milk and you can gradually maintain it, that causes a shift in the type of bacteria that colonize your gut. And it changes them into a profile, mostly of bifidobacteria, that don't ferment lactose, they actually metabolize it, and they don't give rise to CO2 and gas. And again, it's important to differentiate this from a bona fide milk allergy, right? Milk allergy is something that's different. It's an IgE-mediated reaction to proteins that are in dairy. We're talking about lactose specifically. And so it's an interesting phenomenon of how the lactase persistence, in other words, non-lactose intolerance, that's the phenomenon that seems to have evolved. The evidence suggests that, kind of the evolutionary theory, that we all had lactose intolerance, but those, mainly of Northern European descent, who started growing cattle and started raising dairy cattle and consuming their products, those who acquired this mutation that enables them to continue to drink milk, obviously provided a selective advantage. And so generally, once a child is born, they have high levels of lactase, and they are what we would call lactase persistent. In other words, they continue to produce lactase. They do not have lactose intolerance. Those who do have that genetic variant, that at some point, not quite adulthood, it actually happens earlier on, like I said, 7, 8, 9, 10 years old. So that's an age-dependent effect. That's actually an epigenetic modification. And so this is the neighboring MCM6 gene. You don't have to know the details of the gene in any detail. But here you can see that lactase persistence, which is the LP, you have the enzyme, you break down lactose into glucose or the lactose. Those who have the non-persistence, that's when it goes into the small intestine. There can be some adaptation to some extent, and that's where you wouldn't see symptoms, but those who don't have that adaptation, they do develop those symptoms. And those who have the CC genotype, that's the one that's most considered strong lactose intolerance. The CT actually used to be thought that it was completely tolerant, but it looks like they might actually have an intermediate phenotype. So that needs to be updated, and that's partly based on some of the work that we've done. Traditionally, the testing for lactose intolerance is done by a lactose test, and so they consume a dose of lactose, and then they do a breath hydrogen test a little while later. And so if your bacteria is starting to ferment it, then you're going to get greater levels of hydrogen that's produced. And so here's a graph that suggests that the heterozygotes might actually be a little less tolerant than the TTs, because where those hydrogen just goes down, for them it looks like it might actually stay up a little bit. And the CCs would be like way up here. It's not on this graph. This graph is just to determine if heterozygotes have an intermediate phenotype, because it was kind of a controversial point. Now, I mentioned that this is an age-dependent phenomenon, right? Why is it that you're born with the genetic variant, but it's not until a certain age that you actually manifest those symptoms? And this was just discovered a few years ago, just in 2016. I mean, for you, that might seem like a long time ago, but for me, that was just 6 years ago. Before that, we did not know why that was the case. And this is a paper that's published in Nature, Structural and Molecular Biology, actually by a group here at U of T. And so what they showed was that those who have the C allele, remember the C allele is the one that's associated with lactose intolerance compared to the T allele. So those who have the C allele, that gets preferentially methylated. That region with the C allele gets methylated. And because it's in the promoter region, that causes silencing of the gene. So all of a sudden, these promoters that activate the gene are no longer able to bind, and you don't get transcription. It's really fascinating because this shows how epigenetics is important. Right? Remember I told you before when we were talking about the different kinds of omics? So you don't need to take a biopsy of someone's small intestine or their colon to see if they have that methylation, that epigenetic change. You just need to measure their DNA from cheek swab, saliva, blood, any other sample. And if they have the C allele, or the CC genotype, then you know that predicts lactose intolerance because that's going to be preferentially methylated, and specifically in the gut. Right? And that's why, again, epigenetics is tissue specific. So this was a really elegant mechanistic study that pointed to the reason why, even though you're born with that gene, it's not until later on there's this age-dependent modification that alters the activation of that gene. All right, let me just see how many more slides I have here on lactose. All right, no, 1, 2, 3, just 4 more slides. Let me just go through these very quickly. I think Dr. Hanley touched on some of, did he give the example of dairy and type 2 diabetes or cardiometabolic disease at all? In some of the examples he gave? I know sometimes he does, because I know his group has done some work on that. Again, the research has been inconsistent, linking dairy to cardiometabolic disease. Dairy obviously has a number of important nutrients, but some other things like saturated fats that perhaps aren't so good, and maybe some of the sugars, and so it's not really clear if dairy is associated with any of these conditions. And a particular approach that's been used is this Mendelian randomization, which is a concept that your genes determine your exposure. Right? So if you have the gene for lactose intolerance, you're generally going to avoid consuming dairy. So some have shown that the lactase persistence genotype is protective against cardiometabolic disease, meaning that those who have the genotype that allows them to continue consuming dairy, they have a lower risk of the metabolic syndrome. And again, that avoids a lot of those confounders, issues around the food frequency questionnaire, recall bias, all of that, because your genes make you avoid or seek a particular factor. Other studies have shown that milk is not associated with type 2 diabetes or being overweight, again, using a Mendelian randomization study. So what Mendelian randomization is it's an epidemiological study design where we use genetics as a surrogate for an exposure. And here, this can actually help determine in a causal way, as opposed to an observational study that could be due to confounding. And because generally the gene gives you a prediction of almost lifetime risk, right? With lactase, it probably starts around 10 years old. It gives you a much more reliable overall estimate. And again, it's based on Mendel's law of independent allele assortments, meaning that having that gene is associated with that particular exposure and not any other disease factor. So here, the genetic variant would be the LCT polymorphism that is associated or predicts a modifiable exposure, and in this case, it's milk. And you can directly associate that that exposure to an outcome. And you don't really have to worry about confounders because they're going to be evenly distributed. Because remember, having a genotype doesn't necessarily mean, besides affecting milk consumption, it's not going to mean that you smoke more or engage in less physical activity, because there's no biological basis for the lactase gene to impact smoking or physical activity. So that's why it's good for measuring long-term exposure. It allows us to also eliminate the concept of, eliminate reverse causation. Just gonna add time here. So that's another benefit, that we can eliminate reverse causation. And then some of the reporting biases of a food frequency questionnaire, you don't have to worry about that because your genes are not susceptible to that. And then some other selection bias, which we won't get into more detail. But this concept of Mendelian randomization is another way of studying the effects of an exposure. But the gene has to be a strong and specific predictor of the exposure. And in this case, the lactase gene is a strong predictor of dairy consumption, and so it's strong and it's specific. It doesn't predict the consumption of coffee or anything else. And here, this was work that was done by another former PhD student of mine, where we looked at what happens with those who have the gene for lactose intolerance. We know that they generally consume less dairy. They self-select less dairy. But we also know that dairy is a rich source of vitamin D. And so here, we showed that those, first in the total population, who have the gene for lactose intolerance, right? These are the CC genotypes. These individuals have lower levels of 25-hydroxyvitamin D, right? Which is not surprising, right? It might seem obvious, but no one has shown this before. That if you have the genotype for lactose intolerance, I have it, that on average, I should have lower blood levels of vitamin D. And we also showed that the heterozygotes, remember it wasn't really clear if they're intermediate. You can see it more in men, that those who are heterozygotes are actually intermediate. Women generally have higher levels of 25-hydroxyvitamin D, and we know things like hormonal contraceptives actually increase vitamin D in the circulation, so that could be why you don't quite see the intermediate effect here, but you can see it definitely in the men. Those who have mild lactose intolerance have lower blood levels, and those who have severe have even lower. And what this tells us is, not surprisingly, not only are they consuming less dairy, but they're also not compensating by getting adequate vitamin D from other sources, like supplements or sunshine or anything else. So again, it's important to note, and this was the type of thing that also got some media coverage. Those who have the genetic basis for intolerance need to be extra mindful of getting adequate amounts of vitamin D, because a lot of people just aren't thinking of that. They realize that, I know I don't drink a lot of milk, but they don't realize that they have lower blood levels, and that actually has been linked to all kinds of health conditions. Okay, I'm going to stop here. Next week we'll carry on and finish up this last section on food allergies, and maybe touch on one other, food intolerance, and then hopefully we'll have time to also talk about the genetic determinants of eating behaviors. Remember to keep up on your readings from your book. There's only 2 chapters that are going to be covered in the midterm, and that is going to be in 2 weeks, and you have the information for where that's going to be. It's not going to be in this room. It's posted on Quarkus. And again, if you have any questions related to the course, please post it on the discussion board.